In response to some of your analysis, for example, the federal finance minister focused on, look, we're kind of in an emergency, I'm paraphrasing, but how much wiggle room do they actually have to do that in your view?
It is a very narrow path.
Last week, the interim parliamentary budget officer sent shockwaves through Parliament when he revealed that Mark Carney is not the responsible fiscal planner that was advertised. He sat down with CTV's Vashi Kappelos to give a clear picture to Canadians. Lastly, the NDP hints at their plans to topple the government and force a spring election. Let's take a look.
Joining me now for more is Jason Jakes. Hi, Mr. Jakes. Good to have you back here in studio. I appreciate you making the time.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation.
Our audience would just have heard a little snippet right now of what you told committee this week about the fiscal outlook that you presented. You said it's not a funny fiscal outlook. It's really serious. Why did you say that?
Well, this is in the report we clearly indicated that based upon the path we're currently on, by our estimates, it raises significant concerns with respect to the sustainability of federal finances.
What does that mean in layman's terms? I'm asking because we hear that word a lot from economists, particularly when we're talking about deficits or balanced budgets, what and what isn't sustainable. When you say that you have concerns about the sustainability of our financial picture here in this country, like what in layman's terms does that mean?
I think certainly from our perspective, we're at the precipice. So we haven't gone over the precipice. We're kind of looking out over the cliff at this point, and we're at a point where, based upon our numbers, things cannot continue as they are. And I think everybody knows that, right? So what we've done is we've taken what everybody's feeling in terms of the anxiety across the country at this point, positive economic growth that doesn't necessarily feel very good, and we've actually put numbers around it with respect to the federal government's deficits over the next 5 years. And for us, it's really important to set the table for parliamentarians so they know what to expect, so they have a better sense of the overall context within which they're going to be presented with Budget 2025.
So what's at stake at the precipice? Like, if you fall over the cliff, what's there? If you're able to go the other way, what's there?
Obviously, you don't want to go over the precipice. That's probably...
Like, what happens, though, if you do?
Nothing good. And nothing good. And I think for parliamentarians, and certainly I think all Canadians are very much aware of the challenging economic times that we're in, and the fact that we're going to have more challenging times as we go forward, both in terms of trying to manage the deficit. So there isn't a lot of fiscal space the government has to actually work with at this point, but I think also more broadly looking at the restructuring of the Canadian economy. So something we've touched on as part of the committee hearings, and I think other people have highlighted, is this world order that we've had for the past 75 years is done. That both has geopolitical considerations around additional spending or increasing spending on the defense side, which is definitely a spending pressure. It also has immediate pressures in terms of the Canadian economy and the definitely the attenuating or the diminishing of the linkages with the U.S. and our need to find other linkages outside the country. So in short, it means a lot of change within a relatively short period of time.
So, ladies and gentlemen, Jason Jakes, and not changing his tune from what he was saying in committee. And some people may have wondered if he was going to, was he going to get a phone call from somebody saying you're being too alarmist or anything like that? But he's keeping the same stance. I do wish he would have been a bit more specific to Canadians in terms of explaining to them what it actually does mean if you go over that cliff. And really what it means is every time the government borrows money or spends into a deficit position, everything gets refinanced and those interest rates go up dramatically if our credit rating dips from AAA to AA. That's a big problem. Debt servicing costs go up, everything gets more expensive, inflation goes up, and then it just has this percolating effect all the way through the economy. And I think that's what he's trying to say here when he's basically saying, well, nothing good, because the issue is, I think in order to explain exactly what happens, that is a very, very long answer, because it will affect virtually every aspect of the Canadian economy in a negative way, very negative way. So I imagine that's what he's trying to say there, and he's probably also trying not to sound too alarmist as well. But this is important to hear. It's important to hear for the swing voters that are watching CTV. They need to hear this. And no doubt, many of them that were deciding whether or not to vote Conservative or Liberal are listening to this and saying, well, but wait a minute, I was told that Mark Carney is the genius that's going to get us out of this. What do you mean that we're at the precipice? What do you mean that their budget is going to be a risk to the economy? And so it's prompting all of these good questions to these swing voters, and hopefully they'll start paying more attention and listening to what exactly is going on, not just what they're being fed by Liberal talking points.
What does it mean for the near term, or the more immediacy, though, as far as impacts on both the economy and what you're looking at, the fiscal outlook? And I ask because in response to some of your analysis, for example, the federal finance minister focused on, look, we're kind of in an emergency, I'm paraphrasing, but we're going to need to provide certain supports and ensure that our economy can withstand that. I sort of interpret that as, we will have to spend more than we would have liked to, let's say, because we have to address the imperative that this trade war with the United States has created, and the sort of shock factor to our economy. How much wiggle room do they actually have to do that, in your view?
It is a very narrow path. It's a very narrow path, and it's going to require both consideration of shifting spending within the federal government, in addition to reducing spending or potentially cutting programs in some areas, as well as potentially some consideration around increases in revenues, in order to make sure that the Canadian economy, Canada, is actually able to navigate that very narrow path.
And this is what we're saying. And of course, Francois-Philippe Champagne is saying, we will take no lessons from the Trudeau Liberals, even though I was a part of them, Mr. Speaker. That's what he's saying. Because he's trying to say, oh, well, we're in emergency spending mode. And even though this has been essentially the department that's been running under the Liberals for the last 10 years, I'm going to try to disagree with them, but not disagree with them, and say that yes, as all that's fine and dandy, but this is a unique situation. Never mind the fact that we've been in power for the last 10 years that has led up to this situation. Never mind the fact that they were left with a balanced budget. Never mind any of that, right? They're in a situation which they themselves helped to create. It's not just on them. Donald Trump had a impact on this as well, but they had control of their own destiny, is what I'm trying to say. When you have these sports teams, like, for example, the Toronto Blue Jays, who just won the AL East. Congratulations. You get to a point where you're ahead, but if you start losing, you lose enough times where winning actually is no longer in your hands. You have to rely on other teams losing in order for you to actually win. So the Liberals were in a position where they were in control of their own destiny for the last 10 years, and they squandered that incompetently, intentionally, however you want to frame the narrative. They've squandered that, and now they're at a point where you've put yourself in this position, and now they're trying to say, well, we're in this emergency time and we don't want to spend this money, but we have to. And this guy's saying, listen, you have almost no wiggle room at all. So you have to move spending around, cut spending, or raise revenue. Ladies and gentlemen, what does raise revenue mean? Raise taxes. That's what that means. Liberals keep going on about, we just gave a tax cut to 20 million Canadians. Well, are you going to raise revenue? Are you going to cut spending dramatically, or both, because you can't do nothing. If you do nothing, then you go over the cliff.
If I try to understand that in sort of layman's terms again, does that mean that, essentially they can't just add those emergency measures? They're going to have to take something away.
In order to be sustainable and reduce certainly the anxiety we have in the office, and I think provide a certain amount of comfort both to other members of Parliament, other parliamentarians, Canadians writ large, there's going to have to be some sort of substantial change at this point. I think for myself, I always think of it the best analogy being, you go into your doctor's office, you've had a bunch of tests in advance, your doctor sits you down and she says, yeah, well, there are a bunch of bad indicators on your blood and other bodily fluids, and if you continue everything you're doing right now, you're not going to end up in a good place and not where you want to be. So you need to make some lifestyle changes at this point. And for the federal government, potentially it's going on a bit of a diet in terms of some areas of spending. Potentially they want to bulk up on the defense side and expand those areas. And potentially they also want to consider, taking on additional hours at the office so they can increase their revenues all at the same time.
Do you mean new taxes?
I guess we'll see. There are multiple options with respect to revenues.
Okay, I did want to ask, because one thing in particular when you're talking about sustainability that you flagged was your projections where debt to GDP are concerned. It's been, there's lots of talk about what's the fiscal anchor, what isn't, all that kind of stuff. One of the ones that has consistently, I think, been identified by the previous government, and in some cases this one already, is the debt to GDP ratio. And often, you flagged that going up over the medium term as a big concern. Often, when I have interviewed, let's say, people in the government about it, the counter has been, and this happened during committee to a certain degree as well, it's still not as bad as other countries. Like, relative to the positioning of other countries, that ratio in Canada is better. Does that matter?
He's being very adept with his answers here, because Vashi's trying to ask him for specifics. What can the government do? What should they do? And because the Parliamentary Budget Office is supposed to be nonpartisan, he's avoiding answering any of that because he doesn't want to compromise the appearance of nonpartisanship, right? He doesn't want to be in the position where the narrative is, well, the Parliamentary Budget Officer is telling the government to raise taxes. And then the government raised taxes and they blame it on the Parliamentary Budget Officer. Well, he told us to raise taxes. Don't blame us. Blame him. So he's trying to be very careful on this. And he was, if you recall, he was being careful in committee too. He's saying, well, listen, I'm just the Parliamentary Budget Office. I can't take a position on policy, right? So he's being very careful in that regard. And all his role is to say, this is what your fiscal plan says, and you need to make a change, either cut or deal with revenue. I'm not going to tell you how to deal with revenue. That's policy. That's for you to figure out as a government. I'm not going to tell you where to cut. I'm not going to tell you how to cut. That's policy. That's what you have to figure out as a government. So he's being very, very careful. So if you're wondering why he isn't giving direct responses, that's why.
I'm the Canadian Parliamentary Budget Officer, so from my perspective, I'm focused on the Canadian context and not actually being aware of what's going on in the other jurisdictions, but very much focused on the Canadian federal context. And having an increasing debt to GDP ratio over the next 5 years is considerable cause for concern. If for no other reason, as you point out, it has been probably, I would say, the most important mainstay anchor for federal budgetary targets over the past 30 years. And certainly looking at the people that lend money to the country, it's one of the key indicators that they look at as well.
Why is that ratio important?
Well, because it represents two really important things that I think are really intuitive for people. The first is GDP, and that's the size of the economy. So how much stuff are we producing? How wealthy is the economy and how wealthy are households? And the second is debt. So how much debt do we actually have to pay back? And I think for most people who run their own household budgets, you have a good sense of how much money you've taken in over the course of the year, and what are your payments on either your mortgage, your car loan, and other payments you need to make on a regular basis. And in a situation where the cost of actually servicing or potentially paying down your debt as a share of your overall income, if that's going up over time, it means that you need to make some tough choices regarding, okay, got to pay my mortgage, but potentially I'm not buying chicken this week, and I'm going to shift to something that's a little bit cheaper.
That's a good way of describing it. I just have one final question for you. And I know that your analysis included, I think it was up until August the 11th, the spending that had been announced, new items, but there's some stuff that's happened, since then, and I imagine in the budget there will be other, spending initiatives announced. Plus, you've got a spending review underway, and we don't know what the conclusions of that will be. If you were to take a guess at this point about what the impact in the aggregate of that is on your projections, do you think that an even bigger deficit is possible?
It really does depend on what the government decides as part of the budget, because again, there end up being two key moving parts, both on the spending side and on the revenue side. And I think at this point, it kind of remains to be seen where they ultimately end up. But certainly something that we're focusing on. The short term is obviously important. We're also really keen to see where the government's targets are over the longer term, and potentially a recommitment to a declining debt to GDP ratio over time.
He's really good. Really good. And that last question, it would have been a mistake when Vashi asked him, do you think it's likely that the deficit could be even higher? It would have been a mistake for him to say yes, absolutely, because it starts to make him look more partisan against the Liberals. Now, he may be in his thoughts, but when he's out in the public, when he's on interviews, he needs to be as neutral as possible. So for him to say, I don't know, let's see what the government has, because it wouldn't be appropriate for him to say, yes, it could go up higher, and then all of a sudden the government says, well, no, you haven't even seen the plan yet, and we're actually lowering the deficit. They could argue that, but and then it questions his credibility when making those statements. So basically saying, well, we can only work with the information we've been given, so that's up to the government. The government actually has to make these decisions, so we'll see. As we heard, there's potentially another $20 billion in campaign promises and spending that may actually roll into that. So we may not be at $68 billion for this year, folks. We may be at $88 billion for this year in terms of the deficit. Government has asked departments, find savings, 15% over the next 3 years. We'll see what that looks like. See if that rolls in here at all. Now, 10 to 15% across the board, that's going to work out to be around $60 billion over 3 years. That's not per year. So, what does that mean on the overall budget? Well, it's about $20 billion a year. So if they find that savings, then that kind of nullifies that extra $20 billion in spending and in deficit, which means the deficit, as is outlined by the Parliamentary Budget Office, would be accurate at over $65 billion for the year. So all of this comes into question, and Canadians are now asking, all right, so if this comes to a confidence vote, what's going to happen? Some people have said, oh, well, that's going to mean the government's going to fall this fall. Unlikely, because you need the NDP in order to call this, and it's most likely going to be framed as the opposition parties actually need this budget to go ahead because of where the polls are right now. Remember, Liberals and Mark Carney are going to take any opportunity to say that, listen, we're being prevented from doing our job. We're being prevented from delivering on our mandate. That will almost assuredly lead to a majority government if an election were called this fall. That would be a problem. None of the opposition parties want that. Carney needs more room so people can see he is not what is advertised. It's already starting, but they need more room to ensure that happens. And the NDP need more room to actually complete their leadership race, which brings us to someone that we were speculating may actually throw their hat in the ring, someone that we were saying that if they did, they would be the most viable candidate, Heather McPherson. So she has officially announced that her campaign for leadership of the NDP has just begun.
My name is Heather McPherson, and I am running to be the next leader of Canada's New Democratic Party. We don't grow by pushing people out. We grow by bringing people together. That's the path that Jack laid out. That is the path that Rachel paved. And like them, we need to make space for everyone. We need to fight for fairness, and we need to stay true to our values, and we need to build a competitive and winning team to make sure that there are more New Democrats fighting for Canadians.
So, it's Heather McPherson, Member of Parliament for Edmonton Strathcona. Interesting that she said that we need to not push people away. We need to bring more people in. Well, one way to do that, Heather, is to not put limitations on the demographic of people that can actually, A, go to your conventions, because right now, you can't have more than 50% of people that are going as delegates to your convention from your ridings as white males. So that would be something to take a look at. And two, that they can't actually vote for the people that are running in this race if you're over X amount of threshold in certain demographic. So that might be something to look at if you want more people to come in and if you don't want to push people away. Friendly suggestion. Take it or leave it. Now, one other thing that Heather McPherson did say in her leadership bit that was very, very interesting and telling, and this matches up with something that we heard that Don Davies ended up saying to one of our sources behind the scenes. What was that? She said in her speech, she warned the next election could be held as early as this spring and said the NDP, quote, needs a leader that is ready now, ready to hold the government accountable in the House of Commons, ready to organize and campaign across the country. This is the signal that the NDP are looking to get this leadership race done with and getting ready to go back to the polls as early as the spring. Why? There's a lot of reasons why, folks. But the main reason is that right now the NDP cannot do anything, and I mean anything within this government, because they can't go to committee unless they get permission from the other parties, and you almost never hear them ask any questions in question period. So there's those reasons, because they don't have party status, but the most important one is they don't have funding and they don't get resources, the resources that they would otherwise get as a recognized party in Parliament. So it's much more difficult for them to do anything and actually demonstrate to their voters that they're doing anything. And you need to be able to do that in order to garner more support. So rather than let the NDP fade into obscurity, which is what would happen, and rather than cross the floor to the Liberals, their plan seems to be get this leadership race done with, try and form a new identity, try and form a new image and a new brand, reconnect with their base, and try to steal some of those Liberal seats back, because they need at least 5 seats in order to actually get back to the big boy table, as it were. And the best chance that they have is to steal them back from the Liberals. Now, when it comes to a conservative perspective, that's what they want. They really want that. They want the NDP to get back engaged, and they want them to start chipping away at the Liberal base, because that's the closest to the NDP. So if everything normalizes like it was prior to the last election, then what you're looking at is if the Conservatives hold their support and do nothing but hold their support and then don't increase it at all, then what you're going to see is you're going to see the Liberals drop to the high 30s and the NDP increase to the high teens, low 20s, And ladies and gentlemen, what does that give you? That gives you a conservative majority government. This is why we've been saying a healthy parliament needs a strong NDP, and the best friend of the Conservatives for a majority government is a strong NDP.